Hello everyone, we're having another amazing session ahead of us. So we're going to listen straight up from the pioneers of VR and immersive storytelling. So today with us are Paul Raphael, co-founder and chief innovation officer at the Emmy-winning studio Felix and Paul Studios. They actually made the first VR film ever, so the pioneer title is not a coincidence. And we also have Amy Jupiter, who is the founder of By Jovi, and they will basically share lots of insight lessons from both of their paths. So give it up for Amy and Paul.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Excellent. I'd like to welcome everybody to Lessons from the Pioneers. I'm less probably of a pioneer than you are, but I have the great pleasure of speaking with Paul today, and one of the founders of the narrative cinematic VR company, Felix and Paul Studios, and they are celebrating their 10th year in this business. And Paul asked me if I would come and have a conversation with him today about my experience. And as I said, I am Amy Jupiter. These are my titles. I wear a lot of titles. But these are the companies. I've only worked at a few companies in my whole life. And most of them, one of them, Walt Disney Imagineering, is where I've spent most of my adult life. And how many of you know what Walt Disney Imagineering is? Excellent. So just for those of you who have been living under a rock, there is audio with this, in case it's not on there. There you go. Thanks. So I've had the pleasure of working on many of those projects, and the reason I think that Paul asked me to speak with him is that I think that theme parks are the ultimate in VR. Our screens are just 100 feet wide and 75 feet tall, but I also think that we take into account human beings, and Felix and Paul, I think, really changed my whole opinion about wearing any device. I hate to put any device between me and my experience, but I had an epiphany when I first saw one of their projects, and it felt like they had taken me into account, a human being watching it, and not isolating me from this, from the experience. And I thought, oh my goodness, these are other Imagineers, people who take sort of creative imagination and technical know-how and make a human story where I could inhabit it safely. So do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how you got started and your approach and philosophy to making these sort of immersive experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we actually, Felix and I met now close to 20 years ago, right out of film school, and we were, we started out as filmmakers working within the frame. And, but we both had a fascination and a passion for the power of immersion that certain films could evoke in viewers. And they were very rare, and they were mostly films that were not necessarily generally mainstream, considered mainstream. Some of Kubrick's films, but also films by Ozu or films by Tarkovsky, or films that usually had a lingering quality. And while we were fans of this and wanted to create that kind of film as well, we started thinking, well, if immersion is what's interesting to us about those films, well, why don't we just actually think about immersion, physical immersion, right, in the way we tell our stories. And that was around the time where, you know, digital projections and anamorphic and stereo and all of that stuff was kind of coming, well, in case of stereo, that was coming back, but, you know, multimedia, you know, interact, all these things were coming up, and we're like, all right, let's start thinking outside the frame, and how can we bring all these things together to create more of an immersion beyond the frame? And we did that for a few years, and one day, of course, in 2013, the Oculus Kickstarter came out, and we were kind of intrigued by the potential of an affordable device that could basically put you anywhere, right? And so the minute that we tried the first DK1 of the Oculus Rift, we realized that everything we were trying to do was actually encompassed by this device in a way. At least it certainly facilitated, and it seemed like an incredible platform to start building. And so we, you know, basically from one day to the next, dropped everything we were doing, dedicated ourselves to figuring out how to get reality into this device, because of course there were many demos, all of which were rendered, real-time rendered, games or demos or things like that. There was some video, but it was monoscopic or partially immersive. And you know, it's kind of a contradiction to do stereo panoramic imagery, right? I mean, panoramic by its nature needs to be filmed from the single point of view. Stereo needs two, so how do you make these things? Anyways, we figured out a way to fudge it and make it work, and that, you know, brought us to the first piece we ever made, which was Strangers with Patrick Watson.
Right, and plot-driven versus pervasive story, where you experience it with no words, because we obviously, it was like, I would love to just bag through those other slides, because I really want to get to your highlight reel, because I think because you know, this is me at work on Pandora, but this is also me at work, you know, where our ride just happened to leave the planet. But each one of those things, like, who doesn't want to go to space, and who doesn't want to imagine? But space is not this empty place, you know. And I think that what you all have done with your explorers, that we are all explorers, but people who do research, when they come back and talk about something and they tell the story, but you're able to sort of bring us to this place and leave us with sort of a spark in our knowledge. And so curiosity, I think, is what really you all seek to help us fill a gap in our knowledge, but physically, you bring us there. And so I think that it would be great to ground our audience in a little bit of the highlights of your work, and so that then we can talk specifically about it, because I get excited about seeing the work. So could you play that first video, and we'll have some highlights, and then we'll be able to sort of talk a little bit more specifically about specific projects.
The White House is the people's house. Michelle and I always joke, we're just renters here.
My name is Dennis. Dennis.
Chief is a stray dog who is rounded up with all the dogs in the city.
Basketball, a big part of our family.
That captured a moment. Adapting to life in space, it's been a process.
Just absolutely beautiful.
It's an amazing body of work. I think so many transporting places, to be able to provide access. I love to talk about providing access, and whether it's access to our process, that everybody in the room is Imagineers. But where you and Felix and your group of artists have taken us, there's so much technology in there, and yet it's such a human experience. It's at our scale. And do you want to talk about a little bit of how you make that magic, how you make it so that I don't feel overwhelmed by the places that you're taking me?
Yeah, so, it starts with the fact that with virtual reality, you can actually simulate reality, that's, as the medium implies, and it's not just a question of immersion isn't automatic. By just being in something, you don't necessarily feel immersed. We've always treated the camera as a human being, as the viewer, right? And that's not just, it's kind of obvious because that's where the human's head is going to be eventually. But for example, when we did the very first piece with Patrick Watson, we went to his studio and we asked him, where would you put, or where would someone naturally actually sit down if they were going to be listening to you perform, right? As well, people have a tendency to take this poof and like drag it around there, and somehow they gravitate towards that spot. I'm like, all right, great, let's grab that poof, let's slide it under the camera, and let's put the camera there. And he was instructed to also behave as he would were someone to be there. So not only do you feel like you're in a natural place to be, but he behaves in a way that is natural and that facilitates that connection, right? And that's something that we've carried through just about every piece we've done since then, is both for the subject and for the for the audience and the subjects to be conscious of. For us to be conscious of that those actually being together, right?
A lot of sitting back and listening and being in the space where you're actually having a conversation. It's so interesting as you move forward and evolve your work. There seems to be this change of posture. Right, because all of those, there's a lot of sort of sitting and relaxing, and that's really why I think I felt so engaged. So immersion to me, when people ask, oh, what's an immersive thing? It's about getting into a hot bath, right? But then posturally, you as a company and you as an experience have now shifted, and you're asking us to stand up. You're doing free roaming, or actually safely free roaming within a narrative, within a sort of, just because you can go anywhere doesn't mean you should. So you lead us on a journey with the infinite. But you've asked us now to stand up. But you've also now had also a 3-act structure to your experiences. Do you want to talk about the sort of the shift in mindset? Then you're also using it in the same medium you've always used it. So can you talk a little bit? I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I'll just maybe start the slideshow, which is just going to play in the background, if you don't mind, which is the last video. So maybe before talking about standing up, let's talk about sitting down. Just about, again, starting with strangers, the experience is from a sitting position, right? And that's the position that the viewer will be when they watch that experience. At least that's what we encourage. And there you go. And that's been true throughout. Most of the content we filmed was from either a sitting position or from a mental position that disregards your actual physical position, right? Or at least where it doesn't create a dissonance, right? For example, shooting from standing height when someone is sitting, sure, that could be an interesting effect to put you in something or someone else's perspective, but it creates a dissonance. You're no longer necessarily yourself experiencing what is being shown to you. Whereas sitting down, you lose that reference because we sit down on different height chairs or benches all the time, right? We lose that. You could, even if there's a discrepancy on what you would actually, the height you would actually be in, you don't feel it as much, right? So even when we're doing something like, for example, the People's House, where you are kind of traveling through the White House, and we didn't want to just sit you in those rooms. What we did is we sat you next to Barack when he's talking to you, but when he's referring to a room in the White House, for example, we actually slowly float you through that space, and we're revoking here his memory of that space, because we knew that the piece would come out once he would no longer be in the White House, and this whole thing was really kind of his memoir of the experience, right? And so you're remembering those spaces. And the fact that it's moving slowly and creates this dreamlike, memory-like effect, right? And so we've always been very conscious of the physical position of the viewer in relation to the physical position of the VR camera. And so when we finally created the Infinite, which is the free roaming experience, maybe a few words on what that is for those who don't know, because I think most people may have seen some of this stuff, but not necessarily the Infinite. So, after filming, we've been filming we started working with NASA about 6 or 7 years ago, and we started filming down here on Earth. And the ultimate goal, of course, was to film in space. And when we finally did send those cameras up there, and we started getting that footage back down on Earth, we had this urge to figure out a way to get that, content out there to people who didn't necessarily have VR headsets, right? There's just more and more people who do have them, but still, it's a very small audience compared to the rest of the population, of course. So we designed the Infinite to be as large scale, to have the highest throughput possible. We have up to 160 people at once in a roughly 10,000 square foot installation. It varies in size depending on where we set up. In it is a life-size reproduction in VR of the ISS. It is stylized. It's not photorealistic. And everyone sees each other as avatars, and as you, these stardust particle beings, and as you wander around you can see who your friends are, who the others are. And inside are these geo-localized floating orbs that you can touch and that take you into short capsules of video content that was filmed on or off the International Space Station. And you spend about half an hour exploring the space, and then it culminates in you sitting down on a virtual physical chair and seeing a 10-minute spacewalk, so that we also filmed outside the ISS. So that's the Infinite, and it opened in Montreal 2 years ago. It's been touring the US for the past 2 years, and we just brought it back to Montreal, and it's been evolving with every city, and it's been a great learning experience. But to the point where we fell in love with that medium all over again, right? We fell in love with virtual reality as a physically embodied medium, and so to talk about that transition from sitting to standing, even when we weren't moving, even when we were sitting down, even when there was no interactivity, we created our experience as if you could. Like you were just as physically, like I said, the sitting down, this correspondence. And so once you stand up and you get that physical embodiment, we don't feel a discontinuity with what we did, but there certainly is a liberation that came with that. And so it doesn't feel like two different things. It just feels like the thing has literally stood up, right?
Right.
And it's funny how that was even possible, because as you could see right there, in the ISS there is no sitting or standing, right? And so when we were filming for a year and a half before deciding to do this free roaming experience, we couldn't have done this halfway through shooting an experience down here on Earth, right? Because we would have been shooting for sitting or standing, well, usually sitting. But in space, there is no such thing. So the footage worked just as well whether you were sitting or standing, right? And so we could now take you, right, up off your chair, walk around the ISS, activate an orb, and feel perfectly natural standing there and experiencing this content that was filmed in space. And it's worth mentioning that a lot of the content that we show in the Infinite, not most of it, is available, in different forms online, mostly on Meta's platform, who we've been partners with for almost the entirety of the studio's life. But you show someone the same thing, right? The same, let's call it, a shot of, being at the dinner table with other astronauts as they're having dinner. At home, sitting down, and they'll have a reaction. The same content after they discovered it themselves while wandering and activating that capsule, and there's just this amplification of the impact that the same content has, right? Because I think we've gone from this visual and maybe psychological immersion, definitely psychological immersion, to adding its physical immersion that amplifies the psychological immersion, right?
And do you think that stereo, there is a psychology of stereo, like there's a psychology of vastness that the headset, or when we work in stereo filmmaking, that there is a vast change, that you do feel a spatial change from, that your body senses the distance and the size more accurately or more emotionally than as if when you have a square frame, when you have a proscenium. Mm-hmm. So breaking the proscenium, and that seems to take people on a more emotional journey. Do you find that, like, when you look at your work in 2D on a square, and then you put the headset on, do you find that your emotions are heightened? Do you find that psychological change actually brings you into more connection with the material? I don't know if it's intentional. I mean, I know
you mean
curate.
Between 2D and
to the different mediums, between a headset and then the physical. Like, there are three mediums, right? There's sort of the ability to see your trailer, your ability, or the highlight reel, the ability to then put it in stereo, and then the ability to walk through it. Do you find differences emotionally in each of those mediums, and can you be intentional about curating that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, having come from film and giving that up completely and never wanting to go back is because I find it just so much more immersive and so much more impactful. Maybe a few words on why that is. I think it's probably obvious to most people here, but when you feel that sense of presence in any given piece of content, I think that it opens you up in a way that is not impossible in a masterfully crafted cinematic or two-dimensional piece of content, but damn, do you need to be a master to do it to the... It's like the baseline in VR is just so much higher, right?
Yeah.
And you just need to almost not mess it up. You need to let it do that, it wants to do that, and you just, if you don't mess that up, people will feel just this rawness, right, that you get in the real world when you're actually feeling something that you don't necessarily get when you're being shown something, right? And yes, you can empathize with characters on a screen and then have an epiphany or a wonderful experience. It's just, I feel like it's on a whole other level in VR. And then the difference between cinematic and more physically involved virtual reality, I mean, it goes back to what I was just saying, right? It's what's cool about the Infinite is that we kind of get the best of both worlds. We alternate between, right, this physical immersion and then the cinematic immersion. So you get the photorealistic immersion, you get the human, the real astronauts, right, the real Earth,
right.
The real, and then you get the physical immersion as you wander, right? And they're not at the same time. You're alternating between the two. But after 40 minutes, it kind of blends together, I think, and you get that kind of full immersion. Now, eventually, we'll be capturing in volume, volumetrically everything. I mean, if it's hard enough to capture volumetrically on Earth, imagine up in space. But I think we're really on the brink now of getting both at the same time, right? It's the problem with filming something is that it's much harder to make it interactive, even if it is volumetric, right?
Right.
So,
I think, you know, what I loved about your work is that it always stayed with me. And I think about, you know, how perception, sensation, cognition, and then plus time equals memory. And the memory is always sort of better than you can afford. So this experience, so we count on your body being additive when we immerse you and ask you to walk. And I find that time has the ability to dilate time, which is really our job. You know, when you're stimulating someone's body and you use their body sort of against them, do you find that that you had to negotiate with yourself about the time that people spend in when they are being physical, the time, especially, and I'm referring to the infinite, when they're sitting, when you're telling them more of an immersive story that's more linear, they're sitting. Did you manipulate time? Did you feel like you had control over how long the experience felt? And are you satisfied with your grasp on that control?
Yeah, time has always been very elastic in VR. I mean, I think that's true of a lot of mediums, but people's estimates of how long they were doing the infinite varies wildly, like 2x, or you know, like with Miyubi, for example, that was a 40-minute experience that people thought went by in 15 minutes sometimes, and sometimes it went in the other direction. You know, we don't have, not having our physical body, our watch, our phone handy, you know, I think we enter a almost trance-like state when we're fully captive in a VR experience, when you have that full suspension of disbelief going on, that we are so easy, that we have so much experience in cinema, right, doing, and that is, I think, still being figured out in VR, even though we've been doing this for 10 years. I say being figured out because, you know, we don't do just, you know, you can't just bring in so many of the tools and tricks and sleights of hands of cinema or you know, into VR. So there's a lot of things we just don't do. We don't allow ourselves to do until we like figure out a way to do it, right? So our palette is still much more constrained. But, you know, once you add that physical element, again, the time dilation is even more elastic. I think the more you're immersed, the more it becomes dreamlike in the sense that you can, you know, time perception in a dream is so, you know, you could, you know, in the 8 hours that you're asleep, you could feel like you've lived a lifetime, right? And
I love when you talk about the sort of the dream camera, the imagination camera, when you're using when you talked about memory camera, like these are actual cinematic vocabularies that you have developed in the medium, because the medium is really important, I think, to be the master of. We have about 2 minutes left. Do you want to talk a little bit either about where you think you might be going from here now that we've stood up? Do you love sort of the location-based entertainment? I mean, is this where you're going? And where do you see, is AI going to help you support your next steps, or where are we going?
So we're certainly still doing a lot of stuff that is accessible, you know, at home. With the Infinite, we found a direct conduit to an audience, right? Which is amazing, you know, both from a creative standpoint, from, you know, also liberating financially. Like, it's like, okay, you know, we've had incredible partners throughout our last 10 years, but we've been dependent on them, right? We always had to, you know, and you never know what the mandates of a giant corporation are going to be any given, you know, quarter. And so as great as it has been to be able to create everything we have done, with this approach, we truly are kind of masters of our own destiny. And this large physical space is just such an incredible playground, right? It's like with VR, you have obviously the ability to generate anything or film anything, bring people anywhere where you can get a camera or generate it. But, you know, they'll be constrained to sitting down or a small piece of most people, right? Some people might have a gym
Right, I
you know,
love the gym. Right.
So, having, in the case of the Infinite, like thousands of square feet, is just magical. It's the most fun Felix and I have ever had, just being able to create with literally no limits, right?
Right.
And I feel like it's unlocking a lot of new ideas, and so certainly we are focusing a lot more on that type of experience, where we've already been working on the next one and developing a few others as well. Of course, the whole space endeavor continues, right? We've gone this far, we can't stop now. To your question about AI, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, even today, right? So we've been playing with generating different, I think it's over.
Yes.
Never mind.
I want to thank you so. I know, it's like, we'll come back next time. Thank you so much for letting me share the stage. Thank you so much for all the work that you've given the world. And we'll see you all.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.